Our next speaker is the open source manager at Twitter, and you probably have seen him if you're working on anything in Eclipse. He's all over the Eclipse ecosystem, spearheading new projects over there as well. Like me, he has Z in his last name. I only have one Z in my name. He has two, so I'm not even going to try to say his last name. I will just welcome Chris, open source manager at Twitter. Come on out, Chris.
Hey, how's it going? You guys hear me? Awesome. All right, so how's it going? So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about open source at Twitter and basically give you a little story of how kind of our culture has been influenced by open source and kind of what we do in the open, and also explain a little bit about what we're planning to do in the future. First, I have to be shameless, so feel free to tweet about my talk, the conference, and all that good stuff. It's always fun to kind of read the timeline and tweet stream afterwards to see if people either love it or hate it. So good times. So. All right. So a little introduction about myself. My name is Chris Anazik. About a year and a half ago, Twitter approached me saying, hey, engineers are kind of running this insane asylum. We're using tons of open source software. We kind of want to add a little bit more maturity to it and also give back to the communities that are important to us. So I'm like, sounds like an awesome opportunity. Let's do it. And a year and a half later, here I am talking to you guys, essentially. So I can't do a talk about Twitter without actually introducing what Twitter is and kind of how we view the service. So I'll do a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about our open source culture at Twitter. Then I'll kind of go through a nice little anatomy of a tweet, kind of what happens behind the scenes from an open source perspective once you send a tweet out to the service. And then I'll just add things, conclude things with some thoughts. So from a company perspective and how employees, how we view the service, we essentially view it as a real-time information network that could be used in many ways. But our goal essentially is to instantly connect people with, the most relevant information based on kind of their interest, location, and other type factors. So it's really as simple as that. A good example of kind of how people are using the service. It's always interesting to see what happens. So about a year ago, there was an earthquake in Virginia, right? So about roughly a year ago. What was interesting about this is, of course, when something crazy happens, you have, people out there tweet, right? So, good old, Jordan Junkie Juice sends a tweet out 20 seconds later. And what's fascinating about this is that our employees in our New York office actually heard about the earthquake on Twitter before they actually felt it, which isn't like intriguing to me from my point of view. So if you actually look at it, so you have the epicenter of the earthquake was in the Virginia area, kind of in the boonies. And New York is about 200, 300 miles or so away. Seismic waves take about 2 to 3 minutes to get there. So it's interesting, and I think this whole concept of a real-time information network is kind of exemplified well in this this comic by XKCD. So looks like it didn't come up. There we go. Essentially here, the guy's pretty much like, hey, anytime there's like a earthquake, people's first tendency is kind of to tweet within 20 seconds. Eventually, what happens is tweets pretty much, move close to the speed of light. They're delayed a little bit by network lag, but, at a certain distance of like 100 kilometers, tweets eventually, outpace the seismic waves. And, of course, eventually people feel it. And then, generally their natural reaction here is to necessarily don't find shelter. They tend to retweet or do stupid things. So it's a very interesting society we live in these days. But it's not only disasters, right? I'm a huge coffee snob, and love lots of food trucks. So people tend to use the service for all sorts of things. So some people are into politics. So all the crazy stuff happening. It's politics season in the U.S. So people are having fun with that. That's not really my cup of tea, but lots of interesting uses for the service. So now that you kind of guys have an idea of kind of how we view Twitter and as this real-time information network and how people actually use the service, let me talk a little bit about how we use open source to run the service. So in terms of consumption, just like any other company, we use tons of stuff, right? Like, in terms of programming languages, we're mostly on the JVM now. We used to be on Rails when we first started out, but we kind of refactored things and decided to build out on the JVM for performance reasons. So huge Java, Scala shop, we're very active in those communities. Some of our data science guys, sometimes we jovially like to call them neckbeards, like Clojure, so we have some Clojure in our stack. For source control, we're like 99% Git. Our CI system is all Jenkins. So all sorts of stuff. In terms of long-term data storage, we use MySQL. We also use Hadoop quite a bit for long-term storage and essentially the platform that our analytics runs on. So we use tons of stuff. So some of you actually developed on the Twitter API, maybe familiar with dev.twitter.com. That's all based on Drupal. So we have millions of apps there, essentially all using the service that is based on Drupal. The interesting part for us comes in terms of how we view the production of things in terms of the open source side of things. So in terms of philosophy within, let's see if this slide thing will actually work, is when we look at Twitter, what's sacred for us is essentially, our historical data and kind of our ads platform that we're building out. Everything else is kind of ancillary and kind of fair game to be open source. And we essentially take cues from our friends at Red Hat. They had this fascinating saying that I always enjoyed. It was, they had this saying, it was like default to open. So don't think of, what software, you're going to open source. Think of it more of like, what are we going to, assume things are going to be shared by default and just make a decision on what's going to be closed. And I think that's a much better way of looking at things, and that's essentially how we operate within Twitter these days. Some examples of stuff we've done. So Blueprint was an interesting project. So essentially it was our internal style guide. We used it for Twitter.com a little bit, and we also used it for a bunch of internal apps that we wrote. It was great for lazy engineers who hate writing web UIs. So turned out really good. A couple of the engineers on the project, hey, I just pretty much joined Twitter, and they're like, hey, dude, we need to open source this. It's awesome. I'm like, just a front end toolkit, right? I'm a server side guy. Don't really see, anything wrong with this. Not really anything related to RIP. So we did it, and the uptake was out of control. Initially, it just was focused on working on modern browsers because that's kind of what we use internally, and that's all we cared about. When we open sourced it, people were sending fixes to get it running on Opera, all sorts of crazy exotic things, mobile browsers. So it's been the uptick has been amazing, and it's kind of been a good story for us in terms of how open sourcing software and building a community around it could really pay some dividends in the long run. So it's one of the top watched Git projects on GitHub. It's out of control what happens sometimes if you just open things up. Another good example that I like from our stack is Finagle. So like I mentioned, we're running on top of the JVM now. And most of these are little lightweight services that are running on the JVM. Finagle is essentially our asynchronous little framework that we use to run stuff that there's a timeline service, user service, all that good stuff. It essentially is a little light layer on top of the Netty project, which is another lightweight project on top of the JVM that helps with I/O networking and all that good stuff. So great stuff. We have folks from Tumblr, from Foursquare, and other folks contributing this and using this on their own back end. But it's kind of one of our unknown projects. In terms of actual, there we go, fighting with the little projector thing today. In terms of actually production of where we do stuff, if you haven't been hiding under a rock, GitHub has been amazing. It's probably one of the things I think have changed the software industry in the last decade, in my opinion, in combination with Git, of course. We prefer to go there with the majority of our open source projects. We have 80+ projects there now. We even for projects that eventually go to like a foundation, we prefer to start them off at GitHub before we move the project to something like the Apache Foundation. It's really a great service. Let's talk a little bit. Oh, there we go. So let's talk a little bit more about the anatomy of a tweet and kind of what happens behind the scenes. So I'm sure a lot of you are aware that a tweet is simply just a short little message, 140 characters. That's it. It's the atomic unit of Twitter, essentially. Come on. So if we, if you break that down. Sad. There we go. It's working now. So essentially, we break down a tweet. 140 characters roughly translates into 200 bytes. So not too bad. Doesn't sound that much, but you can actually fit a ton of stuff in tweets. So besides like banal, rants and all that stuff, people have done creative things like ASCII art, a little homage to the old days. So people do a lot of cool things, within tweets. If we kind of look at how does it all work, simply, you have a tweet, it gets sent out, it gets sent out to the service, it gets sent out to all the people that essentially follow you. So, boom, we call that essentially fan out. Right? Very, very simple on a high level. Sounds pretty easy? Oh, it's a trick question. The reason is it's mostly one of scale. So we essentially get about 2.8 billion tweets sent out on a weekly basis these days. If you kind of do the math there, that's about 5,000 tweets per second steady state. So that's a crazy amount of scale if you think about it, right? But what's intriguing about this is there's always different peaks, right? So Twitter's very episodical sometimes, and when there's events that happen, you have stuff like Beyonce, right? I'm sure a lot of you are Beyonce fans, but at the MTV Awards, she got out there, had a little baby bump, and people do what they do, they tweet, and then they went crazy. So it had a nice little bump in terms of tweets per second. I'm sure there's tons of you that are football fans here. So last Super Bowl, in 46, there was about 12,000 tweets per second. So it's crazy to see things peak. My personal favorite example here is, I don't know how many are like anime fans or know Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky. Some people in Japan thought it would be an awesome idea if we watched this movie and all send the tweet at the same time. So they did this, and literally the next, we get in the office in the morning, and there's some alerts that went off, and it's like 25,000 tweets per second. We're like, this, for first we thought it was a bug, but eventually we found out that there was these people that thought it would be fun to do this. So, but what was awesome is the site stayed up, which is awesome. So testament to our infrastructure. All right, so let's go actually do a little deep dive in terms of how this actually works. So first and foremost, you send a tweet, it hits our API endpoint status update. So very, very basic stuff. The second place it goes to is, so each tweet has an ID. It has to be referenced somehow. We traditionally can't use like a typical database, auto-increment type thing to do this. So we wrote something called Snowflake that essentially generates IDs really quickly and guarantees that they're unique. So really simple. That code is on GitHub, accessible to anyone. We work on it actively. It's actually fairly simple. The next thing along the tweet kind of adventure here is RockDove. So tweets sometimes have location information, right? So latitude, longitude information. And so RockDove is kind of a reverse geoservice that figures out where the tweet was sent, what places were nearby, where you potentially may be. So that bit is not open sourced yet. We're trying to think of where to put it and what organization it may belong. So it's something we're definitely thinking about. The next step on the tweet adventure is Talon. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that each link within Twitter is wrapped with something called TICO. So the reason we do that is, A, it's definitely helpful with analytics, so it definitely helps us in terms of analytics, but also to help protect our users because it also it helps us prevent spam. So if we detect spam, we could easily block that link and inform our users that, hey, potentially this may be spam. So it kind of serves two purposes. A lot of the client-side pieces are open sourced on GitHub. Twitter text is essentially the main library out there that's available for users. So eventually all this stuff needs to be stored. Like I mentioned before, we are huge users of MySQL, and we actually have our public fork of MySQL is available on GitHub too that we kind of maintain in the open. But essentially we have a little layer on top of it called Gizzard. So Gizzard essentially is just a little sharding replication layer that makes MySQL scale for us as a company. So, I mean, that's kind of the high-level basic, all right, our tweet is finally stored. So what happens next? We get the wonderful, yay, here's our HTTP 200 OK response. You get the tweet, let's render it. We're good to go. After that, there's a lot of other interesting things that happen. So I know, I'm feeding it like way too many transitions probably. There we go. So the next thing is the fire hose. So the fire hose is essentially there for clients that need sort of the real-time access to tweets. So that people like, Bing, Microsoft, and Yahoo have access to the fire hose. Like, they essentially get all the tweets delayed no more than like 100 milliseconds. So that's essentially what we call affectionately the fire hose. After that, tweets go to our early bird infrastructure, which is our search. So when you search for tweets, we do a lot of indexing using Apache Lucene and common stuff. Other things that other people do that have to index a ton of data. And then even after this, which I don't explicitly mention because I mostly focus on kind of the basics here because we only have 20 minutes, we actually have a huge analytics infrastructure, a huge Hadoop cluster that essentially archives the tweets and provides a platform for our data scientists and PMs and other ones to run queries and extract meaning from tweets. And eventually we get to the fan-out stage. So when we go to fan-out, since essentially you could have unlimited followers. People like Lady Gaga has like this crazy amount of followers. It's really hard to store all these typical things in a database, so we basically created a project called FlockDB that sits on top of Gizzard that basically helps us store and scale this information. And that, of course, sits on GitHub with the majority of our other stuff. And then once that is done, your followers are happy, you get your tweet, you see it in your timeline, and you're good to go. So that's kind of like the holistic, a simple view of what kind of happens behind the scenes when people send a tweet in the service. Another thing I didn't really talk about here is kind of what happens on the metal. Apache Mesos is essentially basically is a project that allows you to kind of share resources and essentially a clustering framework. So if you have a bunch of jobs that you want to run on X machines using this amount of RAM, this amount of resources, blah blah, Mesos helps figure that out and divvies out that on our back end. So it's still incubating in Apache, but it's crucial to our infrastructure. Some of you Linux guys are probably familiar with C groups, so it uses C groups to help accomplish its clustering and resource sharing and isolation tasks. We have tens of thousands of machines on our back end, all running. Right now, I think we have a few versions of Linux running, but I think the major one is Linux 2639. So we tend to prefer stability and go with work. So we're a little bit slow to move to the newer versions, but we're always experimenting in the back end. Our Hadoop cluster is, absolutely, it's pretty ridiculous. You got 10,000s of jobs per day running from our data science team and all sorts of other folks. Hundreds of terabytes digested essentially daily by this Hadoop cluster. So it's a lot of data that gets stored in the back end. Since I have a couple minutes left, let me conclude the presentation with some thoughts. So, even though my example was, a little bit silly in terms of like coffee shops and politics and stuff like that, like I hope some of you realize that, Twitter's a real-time information network. Tons of things are happening on the world on Twitter. In terms of technology, it really is a real-time and event-driven problem. While the service may seem simple, on the surface, once you get to a certain scale and have to build out a huge analytics infrastructure and ads platform, it becomes a very difficult and non-trivial problem to work on. I also hope that you understand that we've had some humble beginnings and we've started using open source technology from the beginning. It's completely built. Most of our stack's completely built on open source related projects. And as I mentioned before, a year and a half ago, I joined to help establish our open source office and program and basically try to maintain this kind of healthy and reciprocal relationship with folks out there. So it's one of the reasons we decided to join the Linux Foundation. Even though we're mostly a consumer of Linux and have some of our tweaks, hopefully in the future we aim to start pushing some of our changes upstream and just start collaborating with the community. And so, I'll end this with saying that this is essentially just the beginning of our open source activities and adventure. We're still a young company, and we look forward to collaborating with lots of projects out there that are relevant to our business interests. So, in terms of presentation, this is kind of the end, so feel free to tweet at me if you have any questions. I'll do my best to answer them at the end of it. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. I generally tweet about open source stuff, but sometimes like bourbon and running, kind of my things. And feel free to follow the open source office on Twitter. Other than that, thank you for your time, guys.